If someone dies too soon, we sometimes say the phrase that they were cut down in their prime. Less so nowadays because people usually don't literally get cut down that often anymore. Anyway, there's no person in Tolkien's work that this applies better to than Feanor, the original edgelord and easily one of the most important figures in Middle-earth's history. But notably, his entire stay in Middle-earth lasted less than a year, and he was quickly killed as a result of his own rashness, and, well, the presence of multiple Balrogs. So what happens if Feanor doesn't die so quickly? What if he survived? So a quick refresh on Feanor first. He's one of the greatest elves to ever live. He's incredibly smart, he's incredibly driven, he's an incredible speaker, he's incredibly handsome. He perfected the Tengwa, which would go on to become the widespread Elvish alphabet. He's also credited with the invention of the Feanorian lamps, and he may have created the Palantiri as well. However, he is most renowned for the creation of the Silmarils, a trio of radiant gems which would play a huge role in the events of the First Age. Using his gifts and talents, he inspires the Noldor to rebel against the Valar following the theft of the Silmarils and the slaying of his father by Morgoth. He leads them back to Middle-earth, where they commence their war with Morgoth, and the follow-on of his actions would lead to all of the major events of the First, Second, and Third Age. Shortly after his followers arrive in Middle-earth, they are ambushed by Morgoth's armies. Despite being caught unawares, he wins a stunning victory at Dagor Nuin Gileath, unknowingly saving the elves of the Falas in the process. In fact, he's so successful that he outruns the bulk of his own forces and arrives at Angband's gate with only a small company of his own troops. There, Morgoth unleashes his Balrogs, slaying Feanor's company and mortally wounding the king. Although his sons arrive in time to save him, he dies of his wounds shortly afterwards, robbing the Noldor of one of their greatest leaders before his work even truly began. With Feanor dead, the chances of the Noldor's victory over Morgoth was significantly reduced. Or was it? Despite his brilliance, Feanor was something that many might refer to as a controversial figure. You see, Feanor was stubborn, he was arrogant, he was very insecure, and he had a very poor temperament. His actions were often driven by passion and anger rather than wisdom and logic. His abrasive personality led to him feuding with a lot of people: Morgoth, the Valar, his half-brothers, and even his own wife. This meant that even though he would become king of the Noldor, he didn't actually garner a huge amount of personal loyalty. So let's get back to the present. Everything in the lead up to Feanor's death stays the same, except this time Feanor is rescued by his sons before he is mortally wounded and retreats to the safety of Mithrim. What happens next? Bad things. Now that the battle is over, Feanor has had time to calm down, because when he's not blinded by his own passion, he's actually very intelligent, and with his towering intellect, Feanor realizes that he doesn't actually have the strength to take Angband, even though Morgoth's armies have been destroyed. If Feanor wants to have any chance of completely defeating Morgoth and reclaiming the Silmarils, he needs Fingolfin. And, that's a problem. You see, Feanor and his younger half-brother have never really gotten along. Both of them weren't afraid to hide the fact that they didn't like each other, although Feanor always took it a bit further. In fact, when Feanor was inspiring the Noldor to rebellion, the only reason Fingolfin joined him was because he felt like he had a responsibility to protect his people, partly from Feanor himself. Despite their mutual dislike, Fingolfin was willing to submit to Feanor's authority as the eldest. That is, until Feanor abandons him in Ahriman and burns the ships at Losgar, forcing Fingolfin to cross the Helcaraxe. After this happens, it's said that Fingolfin really wants to see his brother again. And no, not for good reasons. So Feanor and Fingolfin hate each other, which is an immediate problem if the Noldor want to work together again once Fingolfin arrives in Middle-earth. It runs a bit deeper than that too, though. It isn't just Fingolfin that hates him, it's most of his people too, including many of the other Noldoran princes. Turgon especially hates Feanor. He already didn't like him in Valinor, and that increases 100-fold once he loses his wife crossing the Helcaraxe. Finrod is close friends with Turgon, so he probably shared similar sentiments. Even the Noldor who actually agreed with Feanor, like Fingon and Galadriel, didn't like him either, and considering Angrod and Egnor later feuded with Feanor's sons, there was likely no love lost there either. To put it bluntly, a lot of people hated Feanor, and they weren't exactly unjustified in doing so. When Fingolfin arrives, there are going to be major problems. I wouldn't rule out battle considering the fact that the brothers have almost come to blows on several occasions, and on this occasion it's very likely that neither brother would back down. Fingolfin has been pushed too far this time, and he has the numerical advantage, whereas backing down isn't in Feanor's nature. In a worst case scenario, battle is joined upon the shores of Lake Mithrim, and the Noldor effectively destroy themselves before they even have a chance to get started. Best case scenario, we get a Cold War situation similar to what actually happened. The worst case scenario is pretty self-explanatory. Everyone dies pretty quickly, so it isn't really worth talking about. But let's talk the best case scenario. You might be thinking, Cold War between the Feanorians and Fingolfin's people? That's not so bad. Surely it can't be solved just like what actually happened between Fingolfin's people and the Feanorians when Feanor was dead. Well, there's no guarantee that it can't be solved. But let's talk about the circumstances that led to the solving of that problem. After Feanor's death, Maedhros was captured by Morgoth in a phony attempt at negotiations. When Fingolfin arrived, he found his brother dead and the sons of Feanor stuck in limbo, likely led by Maglor, who, I might mention, has the coolest head of the seven brothers. Even without the powder keg that was Feanor, tensions were still quite high, and those tensions were only diffused when Fingon managed to rescue Maedhros, them two having been friends back in Valinor. In response, Maedhros renounces the kingship for his entire house, and pays respect to Fingolfin. This manages to reconcile the Feanorians and the people of Fingolfin to an extent, but it would still require the Feanorians to remove themselves to the eastern Beleriand, largely because Maedhros couldn't trust his younger brothers to not be assholes. If Feanor survives, Maedhros never negotiates with Morgoth, meaning Maedhros is never captured. If Maedhros is never captured, there's no chance for Fingon to attempt to reconcile the two factions. And, unlike Maedhros, Feanor will absolutely not renounce the kingship, and even if he does make a different attempt at reconciliation, there's a very good chance that no one will take him seriously, and why would they? He's proven on several occasions that he can't be trusted. Even if he does remove his people to eastern Beleriand, there's a huge likelihood that the two factions sever all communications. When Maedhros was leader, he himself attended councils held by Fingolfin on several occasions, keeping communication alive between the two peoples. Feanor wouldn't do this. One, he probably wouldn't be welcome, and two, he rarely took people's counsel anyway. So if Feanor survives, the Noldor likely end up far more fractured than what they actually were. But what about the Noldoran relations with other peoples? For example, the Feanorians and the Sindar of Doriath always had a tense relationship, which eventually devolved into outright violence once the Oath of Feanor became involved. If Feanor survived, the relationship would most likely be no different, largely because it couldn't actually get any worse. I don't think Feanor is a psychopath. He wouldn't attack them for no reason or because he doesn't like them. Likewise, I don't think Feanor's survival would impact the Noldoran relationship with the Elves of the Falas or the Green Elves of Osiriant. The Falafrim mostly dealt with Fingolfin and Finrod, and that relationship likely wouldn't change. As for the Green Elves, Feanor would probably pay them no mind. He'd view them as completely irrelevant to his cause. What about the Dwarves? I think this relationship might actually end up better if Feanor was alive. The Dwarves of the Blue Mountains and the Sons of Feanor actually had something of a mixed relationship. The Dwarves allied with them against Morgoth, although largely out of necessity, and Curufin got along splendidly with them. But at the same time, Dwarven trade in Beleriand passed through Caranthir's lands, and although this made Caranthir rich, he was somewhat disgusted by the Dwarves, and he wasn't afraid to show this. Due to that, their relationship was never as good as it could have been. Much like Curufin, Feanor had an enormous love for all things craft, so there's a very good chance that he would have gotten along very well with them. Likewise, the dwarves would have greatly respected the leader of the Feanorians, who was also unmatched in craft, and if Caranthir had a problem with the dwarves, Feanor probably would have rebuked his angry son. Feanor also would have respected the dwarven capability for war, and would have seen them as extremely useful allies in the fight against Morgoth. That's not to say that Maedros didn't see that capability, but as we've established, Feanor is incredibly intelligent and his skill with words is unmatched. And the dwarves aren't aware of Feanor's long list of dirty laundry. I think if Feanor survived, dwarven involvement in the wars against Morgoth would be much larger. Now, let's arrive at the big question. How would Feanor treat men? Obviously, we don't know for sure, and that's assuming Beleriand hasn't been overrun by the time men arrive due to the conflicts between the Noldor. However, there is a bit of a misconception around that paints Feanor as racist, and it is true he does fall for Morgoth's lies that the Valar favour men and intentionally remove the elves from Middle-earth so that men could rule alone. But this alone isn't enough to paint Feanor as a racist. An important thing to note, Feanor never actually interacted with men or dwarves for that matter. He was actually dead when the former awoke far to the east in Hildorian. The only thing we really have to go off is Feanor's own values and his son's eventual dealings with men. As we know, Feanor's main goal is the defeat of Morgoth, and yes, I'm aware he self-sabotages on several occasions, but this is almost always done out of spite. Considering Feanor never encountered men, there's no reason for him to hold ill will against them, so he should be thinking rationally when dealing with them. Should be, anyway. Unfortunately, it's hard to come up with an answer that isn't straight up fanfiction. Fortunately, we have Feanor's sons as measuring sticks. Notably, only a few of the Edain actually served under the Sons of Feanor. The House of Beor ended up serving Finrod, the House of Hador ended up serving Fingolfin, and the House of Halath rejected Caranthir's offer to settle in his lands and ended up settling in Brethil. This doesn't necessarily say that men had it worse beneath the Feanorians. After all, the people of Bor served Maglor faithfully during the Nenaeath Arnodiad, and although the people of Ulfang under Caranthir turned traitor, it wasn't actually Caranthir's fault. They were under Morgoth's service before they crossed the Blue Mountains. However, it might say that men simply felt more comfortable beneath rulers like Fingolfin and Finrod, who were wise and kind, as opposed to the Sons of Feanor, who were fiery and volatile. So, using the Sons of Feanor as a measuring stick, I think the most likely outcome for men if Feanor was alive is the outcome that actually happened. The Edain would simply move on to serve the Noldoran princes. And if that's the case, then nothing much changes. Let's summarize everything. If Feanor survives, the relationship between the Noldoran factions never recovers, and possibly deteriorates into civil war. The combined war effort against Morgoth would likely be non-existent, meaning Morgoth has a much higher chance of winning the Dagor Aglareb, and the Siege of Angband would likely never happen. Relations with the Sindar and Nandor are much the same, but relations with the dwarves improve. The arrival of men probably happens the same way, provided the Noldor are still around at that point. Better or worse? I'm going to throw my hat in the ring and say that it obviously would be worse. My main reason for believing that is because of the lack of a relationship between the Feanorians under Feanor and the people of Fingolfin in Hiflum. During the First Age, these were the two main forces that kept Beleriand safe for hundreds of years, but only through cooperation that allowed them to maintain an almost 400-year-long siege, and cooperation that allowed them to respond to threats with combined operations. Without cooperation between these two groups, there is no Siege of Angband. And because Angband cannot be taken by these elves alone, Morgoth has the opportunity to send out assault after assault to devastate the lands of Beleriand. And the Dagor Bragollach and later battles prove that when Morgoth managed to isolate his enemies, he was able to defeat them fairly comfortably. Although I recognise Feanor's leadership capabilities, I don't think it alone would make a big difference in the war. I also don't think any increased involvement by the dwarves would be enough to offset this huge disadvantage. And when the wars start going ill, I wouldn't put it past the dwarves to simply barricade themselves into their underground cities and fortresses. So I think Morgoth scored an own goal when killing off Feanor quickly. Sure, at the time it seemed like a major victory given the fact that Feanor was his chief and most deadly enemy. But at the same time, Feanor's death allowed for cooler heads to take control of the Noldor, and ultimately repair most of the damage that Feanor did. In the end, it didn't matter, but if Morgoth had left Feanor alive, he might have been able to defeat the Noldor in a shorter period of time. But this is just the opinion of one man, and opinion and fact aren't always on the same page, as the last few years should tell us. So tell me what you think. Leave your theories, thoughts, or responses in the comments below. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. If you're a fan of Feanor, be aware that I do think Feanor is awesome, but I also think he was damaged goods by the time of his death. More to come, thanks, farewell, and remember, even if you don't like your brother, don't abandon him in a frozen wasteland thousands of miles from civilization. It's not the right thing to do.